idea that borders aren't changed by force, or that the Russians building concentration camps or kidnapping children in Ukraine, he's not bothered by those things in the way other people are bothered by them. And he thinks transactionally and opportunistically. And in that sense, he does already resemble the behavior of many of the autocrats, whether it's the leaders of Zimbabwe or Venezuela, or Russia or China. And I think there's a reason why he tends to speak positively of other strongmen. When he's admirer of the North Korean dictator. He talks also in flattering terms about Xi Jinping and how much absolute power he enjoys. And he has the same scorn for whether it's investigative reporting or whether it's the rules and norms around American government, around the Justice Department. I mean, he certainly shares that. I mean, obviously, he's operating in a different system. I've even written recently. I wrote a piece about the ways in which he could threaten our judicial system, and I was again comparing that to what happened in Poland over the last few years, which was an assault on independent judges. And it would be more difficult for him to make changes inside the United States because of the way our Constitution is written. But he could do a lot of damage while trying. And already by altering the norms of conversation, I'll just say this, a lot more of the American government and the constitutional system, a lot more of it depends on an acceptance of rules of fair play or norms or rules of behavior or assumptions about morality. A lot more of it depends on that than you think. So we do have a very legalistic system. We have a written constitution. There are, as you've yourself written about, I mean, there are checks and balances built into it. But nevertheless, respect for all of those things is also an assumption. And the question is, would Trump have that respect? Certainly he talks now about abusing the Justice Department, about locking up his opponents. He's talking about weaponizing state institutions against his political enemies for his political purposes, and that is, it's not that it's never happened before in American history. It has, but it certainly goes against what how our system is supposed to run.
Say more about this crucial question. How could it happen here? You just said that the rule of law is a question of norms as much as constitutional rights. But when you compare the U.S. Constitution to other democracies that have slid into authoritarianism, like Poland and Hungary, are we better equipped to resist it? And give us a sense of how it could happen here.
So as I said, our podcast is about ways in which some kinds of autocratic behavior have arisen. And the first episode was about Republicans who discovered that in order to maintain their status and role inside the Republican Party, they had to accept lies. And we interviewed both a former congressman, but also an election official in Arizona who went through this process of learning that they have to behave in a different way, which to us seemed like a very East European kind of realization. That if you want to get along in life, you just have to accept a conspiracy theory. You're not allowed to fight back against it. So in that sense, we've some parts of American politics have already gone down that road. I mean, in the case of judges, people pay a lot of attention to the Supreme Court and so on. But there's another factor, which is if you look at the behavior of a judge like Eileen Cannon in Florida, what's interesting about her is that she's a judge who is she is under no pressure. She's under no political pressure. She's, the laws on courts, that are in our Constitution to keep judges independent involve making sure their salaries are paid, that their salaries aren't influenced by Congress, making sure they're well paid, making sure they're protected in various ways from political influence. But the Constitution can't prevent a judge who seeks to do a favor for a politician breaking the rules. So it can't prevent somebody who has all the benefits of independence and who's insured against political pressure from nevertheless wanting to play a political game. And so we we explore that idea as well. And almost, when you go through if you look at any U.S. institution, you find the same thing. And so the Department of Justice, until now, and again, you're probably a greater expert than me, has been set up in such a way that it's meant not to function, at the behest of the president. So it has some independent status. It's not supposed to be a political organ that's used to prosecute the leader of the opposition. Nevertheless, that's how Trump talks about using it. And so the question is, would the old standard hold up under pressure? I mean, the U.S. has one huge advantage, which is that we're a very large country. Also, we're a federal system. And so even changes at the top don't necessarily affect the way things work at the bottom. And, we may be in a situation soon where there are enormous gaps we're really there already, between states and how states are run legally and otherwise. But so there would be a lot of elements inside the system in that sense, just at the state level and at the local level, that would push back against any attempt to change the rules. And you would also find, there would be legal challenges, and there would be, it's not like you have a tame judiciary that would just collaborate with whatever the president says. So there would be many places where there would be pushback. Actually, honestly, my fear about a second Trump presidency would be not that he would turn the United States into a dictatorship, but that he would try, and in trying, create a massive amount of chaos. And, that would be all that we would be consumed with that conversation for the subsequent 4 years. And it would make the United States incapable of acting internationally or doing anything positive. That's really my greatest fear. I don't know what this is your world more than it is mine. I'd love to know what you think.
It's now unconstitutional for me to have opinions on this podcast. I'm going to keep asking you, but I'm really struck by your powerful insight that federalism might in the end be the structure that preserves those other democratic values of the separation of powers, the rule of law, and free speech. And also that the danger is that the U.S. in the course of chaos would be unable to exercise the kind of check to autocracy, Inc., that you think is so crucial. We're both interested in what history can teach about the rise of autocracy, as well as what the global experience is in Greek and Roman history. And I think we've both been kind of reading some of that. I was struck in reading Livy and Tacitus, who are Jefferson's favorite historians, about how the brutal bloodbath of Caligula and the Roman emperors, the thousands that were murdered in order to keep them in power, was central in the framer's mind. To what degree does the Roman experience anticipate autocracy, Inc., and the dangers we face today?
It's funny. Let me answer that in a roundabout way. How did I get interested in the subject, which I know you're interested in because I've been reading your book? But while writing a previous book, I was often struck by how shocked Americans are by even the idea that their democracy could decline. How is that even possible? We've been in democracy for X number of years. We've had X number of free elections. How is that even possible? And I kept reminding people, and then eventually went back and reread a lot of this myself. I kept reminding people that the framers were obsessed with the idea that democracy would decline. And why were they obsessed with it? It's because they were reading the history of Rome, and in particular, the period that interested them the most was the period of the Roman Republic and the decline of the Republic and the rise of Caesar and then the rise of empire. And what they had in their heads, literally, when they were writing the U.S. Constitution was, how do we prevent the rise of Caesar? How do we prevent a demagogue from taking over the democratic system, corrupting it? How do we prevent somebody from persuading the people to believe false promises and so on? And our electoral college, the electoral college was not set up so that every 4 years the people of Pennsylvania get to decide who is the president. That was not the purpose of it. The purpose of it was originally to be a kind of break between the popular vote and the presidency, just in case the rabble choose somebody as president who's not appropriate. And this is, of course, nobody talks like that anymore, and it doesn't have that function anymore. And it's actually, I don't think, ever had that function. But certainly the framers of the U.S. Constitution were worried about this. Certainly they talked about it. It's in the Federalist Papers. It's in their debates. It's in even the arguments in favor of revolution a few years earlier. So the question is, what changed? And of course, what changed in the U.S. is a very long experience of success. I mean, really, from the Second World War, and then I think maybe really especially from the time of the Civil Rights Movement, Americans had this confidence that we had a stable and ever more progressive and ever more inclusive democracy. After 1989, we won the Cold War. Our system was the best system. Everybody was going to want to be a liberal democracy like us too. This was the Frank Fukuyama thesis written at the beginning of the 1990s, which actually it's not exactly what he said, but it's what people wanted to believe. And we had this very, very long experience of success, stability, and prosperity, and we just thought that was going to last forever. And I think what's happening now is the thing that the framers were afraid of, that the institution would become weaker, that they would become undermined, that people would feel doubt about them, and that would help enable the rise of a different kind of leader or a different kind of political system. And of course, one of the interesting things to me is the question of whether the Constitution, as it was written, many decades ago, whether it's fit for purpose now, whether it functions the way it was supposed to function. And that's probably a better question for constitutional scholars like yourself or your many colleagues than it is for me, but it's a good question.
It is indeed. The framers are centrally concerned about a Caesar on horseback who will come flatter the mob, persuade them to exchange liberty for cheap luxury, and then install himself as a permanent dictator. Hamilton and Jefferson thought it might happen in different ways. But what does the experience of Autocracy, Inc. teach us about how autocracy could arrive? Does it always come in the same form? What have you learned from Hungary, Poland, and the other countries that you've studied about how it could happen here?
So, we're talking about wildly different countries. When we talk about China, when we talk about Poland, it's very, very different circumstances. I mean, China is run by the Communist Party, which has been in power for a long time and came to power through a revolution. Russia, as I said, is a kind of kleptocratic mafia state where, the leader already had a very weak state when he came to power. It's not as if Russia in the 1990s was a secure and stable political system of any kind. It is true when we talk about Hungary or Poland, which was, as I said, it was a failed attempt. We are talking about a phenomenon that is increasingly normal, which is that of a democratically elected political leader who then, upon legitimately elected, legitimate leader, who upon attaining power, upon winning the election, then begins to dismantle the state. And that was what Orban did. That's actually what Hugo Chavez did. So this is not a right-wing or a left-wing phenomenon. And we sometimes talk about them as if it was only on the right, but it's absolutely the Venezuela is strikingly similar. When you read the history of Chavez and what he did to the Venezuelan state, it's not that different from what Viktor Orban did, or what the Polish Law and Justice Party tried to do during the 8 years that it was in power and ultimately failed. And capturing the state, what does it mean? It means changing the bureaucracy so that instead of hiring people who know about water pollution to work for the environmental agency, you hire your cousins, or your party loyalists. It means seeking to pack courts so that the courts will, at least in political cases, will always decide in favor of the government. It means trying to create rule by law instead of rule of law. And so rule of law means that there's a separate constitution. Courts have some independence, and at least in theory, when they make decisions, they make them on the basis of a constitutional argument, a legal argument. A rule by law means that the courts do what the person in charge says they should do. And so you can see attempts to pack courts in order to create that kind of effect. And again, not unknown in American history to try to pack courts, right? I mean, FDR did it. So these things aren't unheard of in the American past either. In fact, the more you look at the American past, the more you can see attempts to do it both nationally and at the state level. What else does it mean? I mean, it means a It means a personalization of the police. So again, the police aren't there to enforce the law. They're there to enforce the will of the ruling party or the will of the leader. Expression that political scientists use is state capture, meaning